Great. Thanks so much, Cynthia. Hello, everybody. Sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm based in Antigonish, and it's pretty treacherous out there. So I'm glad to be able to join you this way. So yeah, my name is Lise Brin, and I know many of you. I was formerly the scholarly communication librarian at the St. FX, and now I've been working for 3 years with the CARL, the Canadian Association of Research Libraries. And so I believe I was asked to do this session because CARL is in the process of launching a program of activities related to OER. And we're very, very lucky that there have been some really fantastic efforts here in Canada, some really great librarian involvement in many of them. And so we are able to draw from their experience, benefit from their expertise, and hopefully create some programs that will help kind of the library base involved in OER across the country. So with that, I will say I'm not an expert on this. I've had the privilege of speaking with a lot of people about open education and hearing about people's experiences. And so I'm really thrilled about the program that's been put together today. And largely because those experiences are really front and center. And every time I talk to people, and everybody says the same thing: the most convincing, the most useful thing to have in OER are good stories. And being able to hear firsthand from people who are involved in OER, especially students and faculty, is a huge asset. So I really look forward to the presentations we're going to have just in a little bit. And I may even, especially since we're running late, I may shorten my session a little bit, just so we make sure we have lots of time for those firsthand stories. So here's a little bit of my agenda, what I have in mind for today. I noticed that there really wasn't kind of an overview of what is OER, what is open education. So I'll just do a little bit of that just to make sure if there's anybody in the room who could benefit from that you will have it. And I will talk a bit about what's happened and what is happening across Canada. Just a warning, I'm not going to get into individual libraries, what they're up to. We're going to hear some great examples, and there's a lot. So I knew I would miss some really excellent ones. Certainly we have Dr. Rajiv Jangiani from Kwantlen, and so their experiences are, stellar and really inspiring. So I think that will be a really appreciated part for you. And then I will talk about librarian involvement and a bit about what we're planning with CARL. And I've got a few helpful resources for you at the end. So starting off with why OER. And so a lot of us, when we hear about OER at the start, what we hear is the idea of free digital textbooks. And we hear about this in the context of the ever-increasing cost of textbooks. But it's a lot more than that. So certainly from the point of view of students, being able to keep their costs low when it comes to textbooks is a huge impetus for them to get involved in open education. But it's about a lot more than that. It's about leveraging the endless digital learning canvas available to us and the collaboration opportunities that brings. It's about changing educational materials to be in line or more in line with emerging pedagogical practices. It's about social change. It's about being able to reflect diversity of voices within educational materials. And it's also about, I would say, lining up with the larger open scholarship context that we, especially in libraries, are seeing and talking about. So a funny little story for you. When I started putting together my slides, I was like, oh, this is going to take me forever. I don't have a slide deck about this. What am I going to do? And then it hit me, and I felt kind of dumb when it did. But I thought, oh my goodness, what is the principle of OER? It's sharing and reusing and building on each other's work. So many of my slides are from other presentations, and I absolutely appreciate those who have created these presentations, and then I'm able to benefit from them. So for example, I found this slide deck online by Michael Pescovicius, and I believe he's at the Oh, goodness. I should have kept the information about his institution. I think it's the Vancouver Institute of, I, I don't know, but I bet Dr. Jangiani will know. So he has a slide deck about an introduction to open educational resources, and I've put the reliable information at the bottom. Again, I'm happy to share my slides, so I will send them to Cynthia after this. If anybody wants the slides to, again, reuse, you're welcome to them. And so in his slides, he shows this, which is really the intersection of why OER are coming about now, what makes them possible. So this change in philosophy around learning and sharing resources, the root affordances of the internet, the fact that the internet is not just a place to acquire digital content, but where you can share and remix and create. The legal side, that we do have these alternative copyright licensing opportunities now, primarily Creative Commons. And then there's a range of financial models out there. Similarly, he links open educational resources with this larger open movement. And so I think those of us who work in libraries are familiar, having entered into this general area through open access. And we have seen open access move from just purely open access into open data. And more we're talking about open science or open scholarship. And so it's really the larger umbrella. So it's the same idea with open educational resources, that they're part of a larger umbrella. I would say that simultaneously, OERs are not just about the open movement, but also part of the affordable course content movement. And I think we might hear a bit more about that later. So the idea that we're not just working towards open textbooks, or open educational resources, but we're open to using anything that would ensure that students don't incur additional costs for materials for their courses. So that could mean using the resources the library already subscribes to, and more libraries are getting multi-user subscriptions to ebooks that can be used in courses. So I would say it's part of that kind of umbrella as well. So what are OERs? Well, again, I'm borrowing, and one of the creators of this slide deck is our next presenter, and the other two, I believe, are both librarians. So this was a slide deck about specifically librarians and involvement in OER. And so they give this definition: teaching, learning, and research resources that reside in the public domain or have been released under an intellectual property license that permits their free use and repurposing by others. And so it's a good reminder, always a good reminder, that OERs are not just textbooks, but can be absolutely any kind of learning resource, learning material. So typically when we talk about OERs, we talk about the 5 R's of openness. And this was a concept devised by David Wiley. And so basically, when we talk about open, we're not just talking about making it freely available, but we're really talking about these 5 concepts: that you have the right to retain a copy, reuse it, revise it, remix it, and redistribute it. And so when you think about how faculty are currently creating and using content for their classes, many instructors are already partly there. So they might be already using some of these principles, but not all. So it's often a good way to approach faculty around OERs, is to kind of make them recognize that through LMSs and through available content online, OER is almost, it should be a familiar concept to them in some ways. Another important aspect of OER is the ability to openly license content. So there was a time when we talked really around copyright and copyleft, so a complete lack of copyright. But in the current setting, we have really a lot of options in between this middle range, somewhere between public domain and copyright. We refer to this as some rights reserved. So the author still has control and copyright over the content, but can express how they would allow the content to be reused. So the main avenue for doing this currently is Creative Commons, and I suspect most of you are familiar with Creative Commons. These are available, it makes the content available free of charge to the public. These licenses allow creators to communicate very, very directly and simply which rights they reserve and which rights they waive for the benefit of recipients or other creators. And so using a CC license is really the mainstay within the sector. It's pretty much adopted throughout. And so here you have a list of the different types of licenses currently available, and they're listed from the most open at the top to the least open at the bottom. So basically at the top we have the CC BY license, which really only requires attribution, that whoever is reusing the content name and identify the original creator and content. And then as you go down the list, there are some additional details or some additional limits placed on the uses. For example, you can have an NC attached to your license that makes it necessary that it only be for non-commercial uses. So I will mention very briefly that the leading software being used for creating OERs is Pressbooks. I won't get into detail about it since Megan and Kim are going to talk about it later on. But this is based on WordPress, and any of you who have built a WordPress blog will know that WordPress comes with pre-existing themes that you can reuse and adapt quite simply when creating your website or your blog, and the same applies to Pressbooks. So it's a relatively easy system to get into if you've used WordPress. They have a web-based service that you can subscribe to, but most institutions here in Canada have their own installations. There are also some regional installations of Pressbooks in certain provinces. And something that people really like is that you can start off working collaboratively in Google Docs and then very simply migrate the content to Pressbooks, and you wouldn't lose the formatting at that point. And it can output a variety of different formats: MOBI, EPUB, PDF, and also web-based webbook. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the challenges around OERs. Not surprisingly, faculty are often complaining, rightly so, that they are overloaded, that there are huge demands placed on them. So they may be resistant to OERs if they believe that this is going to add extra time requirements for them, either in selecting OERs or in producing them. So that's, I would call that a pretty major challenge. There may very well be technological challenges around adapting and using OERs, either at the institutional level or at the individual level. There may be a limited understanding of copyright or a limited understanding of what OERs truly are, depending on how much exposure they've had to OER. I would say very importantly, probably central, is the fact that faculty are not typically rewarded for creating educational materials or for adhering to open education principles. And in most cases, faculty are very, very motivated by what will lead to advancement, promotion, tenure. And there are only very few cases. For example, at UBC, they have in their teaching stream, it is specifically mentioned in their advancement documentation that producing open educational materials is a positive thing, but that is very, very rare at most institutions. And finally, I would say that what's going on with large publishers is also a bit of a challenge. Large publishers have huge research and development budgets, and they are absolutely getting into producing electronic content, electronic textbooks, which of course are not open, but they have the budgets to create really fancy, flashy digital gadgets or embellishments to their online content. And that's something that the open movement would have a hard time competing with. However, These are all things that can be countered. I don't think any of these are unsurmountable, but it's good to be aware of them, to not minimize the fact that there are challenges, and also to work largely by education to improve the situation or to counter these challenges. So as I'm meant to be here talking to you about what's going on across Canada, I'm going to get into that now. And just to say that I'm not going to talk about what individual institutions are doing. That would take forever, and I'll have plenty to say just talking generally about what's going on across the country. So here we have the 4 programs across the country that are provincially funded, that have received significant funding from their provincial governments. You're probably aware of all of these, BC Campus being the first and still established, eCampus Ontario in 2016 starting, OpenEd Manitoba starting in 2015, and Alberta OER, which unfortunately had its funding ended in 2017, but there are still quite a few institutions in Alberta who have continued with some very important initiatives around OER. So it's had a lasting effect there. I should also say that, as far as I know, all of this provincial funding has always been for post-secondary resource development. I don't think there are any K-12 provincially funded programs for OER. In BC, there is a website called Teach BC, where K-12 teachers can share their own resources under a CC&CSA license, but I don't think that was funded by government. So, as I mentioned, BC Campus is probably the most well-known here in Canada, the most well-known effort around open education. They were the first, and it was funded by the BC Ministry of Advanced Education, Innovation and Technology back in 2012 to create this open textbook project. And initially they had a commitment to provide 40 open textbooks at the post-secondary level, and now they're committed to 60. And those textbooks were focused on courses with the highest provincial enrollment. So really trying to cover and support as many students as possible. I should mention that BC Campus is not just about open textbooks. Their mandate is to provide teaching, learning, educational technology, and open education support to the post-secondary institutions of BC. In terms of the grants it provides are around a number of different areas, definitely the creation of open textbooks, the adaptation of open textbooks. They fund instructor reviews of open textbooks, but they also have an indigenization project where they're creating open learning guides for institutions working on indigenizing and decolonizing their campuses. They also have ed tech projects that are virtual sessions and sandboxes to allow faculty to learn about emerging technologies for education. And they're also funding the creation of Z-Cred or Z-Degrees programs at 3 BC institutions, and that includes Kwantlen Polytechnic University. So I suspect we'll be hearing all about that after this. Very important in BC is that it's led to a number of very active communities of practice. The one of most interest to us, I think, is BC OEL, the British Columbia Open Education Librarians. And they have produced some really excellent materials. They have a website, and they also have combined efforts to support faculty and offer education and support to them. As of December 2018, BC Campus stated that they've achieved over $10 million in savings for students through known adoptions in BC. So that's really phenomenal. And BC Campus has another site, which is Solar, the shareable online learning resources. And so this is where other resources, non-textbooks, would be that you could search for them. And this, you do need to be registered as an instructor, BC instructor, to log in, whereas the open textbook database is widely open. So this is the site for eCampus Ontario. As you can see, it looks a bit similar. There's a good reason for that. Basically, they started off by duplicating the database that is available at BC Campus, and in order to provide this to Ontario educators. And again, eCampus Ontario, similarly to BC Campus, has a broader mandate than just creating open textbooks or open educational resources. So their website states that they aim to be a lead in research, development, and sharing of exemplary practices in online and other forms of technology-enabled learning. And the executive director at eCampus Ontario is David Porter, who previously was the executive director at BC Campus, and he set both up. So if you're looking for a leader in Canadian OER, he's one of them for sure. And they're in the process, because this is Ontario after all, of creating a Francophone open library that should be coming online before too long. And this is absolutely another area of opportunity for OER. Myself, I'm Francophone and from the West in a minority setting. And I know that there's a huge interest in minority Francophone groups in creating and adopting OER so that they can have materials that reflect their own reality and not have to take on Quebec-based materials. And one could say the same certainly for other groups, for First Nations, for example. And I know of one project, I'm sure there are others, the Musqueam Cultural College has some Cree courses that they've created as open educational resources. So there's a recognition that that's a huge area of possibility. And so just about eCampus Ontario, they are reporting that they've saved students already $2.2 million in textbook and course materials costs. And they are obviously aiming to increase that. A big part of what they do, similarly to BC Campus, is building community. So I didn't get into that when I mentioned BC Campus earlier, but certainly this whole building of communities of practice is inherent to both BC Campus and eCampus Ontario. And I would mention one of these groups is called BC OEL, and so it's the British Columbia Open Education Librarians. And so they've done fantastic work of developing common materials for promotion, for supporting faculty. I know there are LibGuide templates that were created that every institution could then adapt. In Ontario, there is a Open Education Fellow program, and also a kind of a loose network of open educational advocates that they call the Open Rangers. So both of those, this idea of building that community of practice, have been really, really central to their work. And again, we have another site in Manitoba. Campus Manitoba has created this database, which again is very similar. It's also based on the original BC Campus database of open textbooks. And they are just getting started in Manitoba. But they've already had 19 adoptions of open textbooks at 7 institutions. And they're about to see a pilot project launched at one of their partner institutions. And that would include grants for additional OERs, and continuing to promote adoption, adaptation, and reviews of open textbooks. Everybody still there?
Yes, we're here.
Just checking. I will mention this. There was an MOU signed, Memorandum of Understanding, signed between British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan back in 2013. And that was to ensure that there would be collaboration on the development of common OERs for that region, and also sharing of OER and resources. So that has been helpful, certainly in creating the programs in those 3 provinces. As far as I know, Saskatchewan doesn't have an official program, but there has been some activity at individual institutions. And then this is the part I'm not really going to get into. We're going to hear from some folks who have been involved in institutional efforts. But I'm just going to let them talk about that when we get there. But just to say that some of the institutions across the country have absolutely invested in creating and supporting open educational resources and open education via financial incentives for faculty, and some of this has been coming through the library or via the Center for Church Teaching and Learning, and in many cases, a collaboration of those two entities. I do want to mention, if you are interested in what Canadian initiatives are out there, or if you yourself have been involved in a Canadian institutional OER initiative, then you should check out the Spark Connect OER directory. You can do a search for institutions that have adopted OER programs or activities. If you search for Canada, these are the ones that show up. I believe currently it's only Spark members that are included, but I believe they're supposed to expand on that. That was my understanding. So there are some examples you can look at and see more about their programs. And I did want to mention the Rebus Foundation, which is, interestingly for Canada, it's a foundation funded. So it's funded by the Hewlett Foundation, which is US based, but the organization is based in Montreal, and they are building their own platform, the Rebus Community Press, based on Pressbooks. And they're really focused on building collaborative tools, supporting the community of OER producers and users. And they're really interested in those unique capabilities afforded by online reading. So they seem like an interesting project. And if you go to their website and look at the project, the current projects, there's quite a range in topics. And it seems really interesting. And anybody can create a project. You build it online. You can join an existing project. It seems like a cool model. And I know that there is some take-up in Canada for this. So moving right along, I did want to talk a little bit about the idea of national support for open education and open educational resources. As you know, in Canada, education is provincially mandated. But nevertheless, there have been some positive signs at the national level. So you're probably all familiar with CMEC, the Council of Ministers of Education of Canada. They had discussed OER early on, back in 2012, and then in 2013, anonymously endorsed UNESCO's 2012 Paris Declaration. So that's an interesting thing in itself. Another really interesting point is that in December 2017, the Canadian federal government's Standing Committee on Finance actually included a recommendation to provide funding to encourage the creation of OERs. So that's really interesting coming from a national federal funding body. It didn't make its way into the budget, sadly, but it's still something we can point to and move on. Of course, if this happened in the first place, if these things have happened, it's largely because of student advocacy. So I totally want to send some kudos out to all the fantastic work that the students group across the country have been doing. I do want to mention, just back to the idea of national funding. So one thing that's interesting is in the US, just like in Canada, the responsibility for education is primarily at the state level. However, March 2018, Congress funded a $5 million open textbook grant program, and it has already committed to renewing that for a second year. So that's a really interesting model and something that we should consider trying to push for. We've already seen in the prior slide there that the Standing Committee on Finance is already interested and open to such a project. So I think there's potential there. So just as I said, student advocacy, this textbook broke advocacy initiative from student groups has been huge, largely via Twitter, asking students to tweet a picture of their textbook receipts. So it's brought a lot of attention to the idea that students are paying a whole lot for textbooks. And I would highly recommend, if you don't know it yet, that you have a look at Guelph University's student textbook survey. There has not been a ton of collection of data around students' the cost of student textbook investments here in Canada. There's been a lot in the US, but not a whole lot in Canada. So at Guelph, the students and some librarians got together and did this survey. They got a spectacular over 4,000 responses. And so now we have some really interesting numbers from a Canadian institution showing just how much students are spending. And things like this, asking students, have you ever not purchased a required textbook? And we see that 57% say that they have done this themselves. So these are really very, very compelling numbers. I think I have one more slide on that. So they were asked about specific impacts of not having a textbook, and they have experienced many of these and are willing to admit to it, which is really, really helpful. So I highly recommend, if you're speaking to your administration, to your faculty, this data is really, really compelling. So I did want to mention this, again, at the national level, that BC Campus leads a group called the Canada OER Group. And so they just put out this update last week. And so if you really want to know what's happened in the past year in OER in Canada, it doesn't have everything, but it does run through quite a few interesting initiatives. And generally, that Canada OER group is really great. It is open. It's a listserv. Anyone can join from across the country. And they're currently bringing together the different groups involved in OER to have discussions about how can we join voices, how can we work together to have a stronger voice. So I really see that going somewhere in the next little while. I did want to mention, I'm sure all of you, well, we're going to hear about what comes after this shortly. But yeah, the CAUL Textbook Survey Working Group put together a really great report that gives an idea of where things are at nationally and how institutions can move forward here in the Atlantic provinces. So I'm looking forward to hearing the update on that. And then I know, just looking at the time, I'm going to spend a few more minutes. I think I've done about 30 minutes so far, if I'm not completely off. Okay, good. I've got my timer on. So I'll talk to you a little bit about library and librarian involvement. So at CARL, we were really interested in knowing more about this. So we knew that there was a lot of interest across our institutions. And CARL is a member-based organization. So we have, I guess I didn't mention this at the start, but we have 31 institutional members. 29 of those are university libraries, so the largest 29 university libraries across the country. Plus, we also have Library and Archives Canada as a member, and the Federal Science Library that's based at NRC. So our members were very interested in OER. We had a working group write a white paper about OER back in 2014, and we have been kind of thinking since how we wanted to support OER. So what we did was we brought together some librarians. I'm just going to move ahead here in August of last year, and we invited a whole bunch, and not everybody could come because it was in August and a lot of people were on vacation. But we did end up with this really great little group, and we captured what their experiences had been like thus far working in OER. We heard a lot of really different stories depending on where they were based. Absolutely, not surprisingly, out in BC, they've been at this for quite a while. They're very organized. They've got the community of practice going, the BC OEL. So they have a wealth of expertise. Whereas in Ontario, they've already had several years under their belt. We've got, representatives from Ryerson, where they're setting up a Pressbooks platform to be used regionally, and they've worked with faculty to create those open textbooks. So we've seen a lot of experience. Meanwhile, we had a representative from Quebec who spoke about, how they're really, really just getting started. What we did hear across the board was that most of these people are not OER librarians. Most of them are doing support for open education as a part of their work. as a part of their larger role. Some of those are scholarly communication librarians, many are not. Some are copyright librarians, some are liaison librarians, but there's quite a range there. And so there was a lot of support for the idea of CARL creating a program, which we were glad to hear. And they gave us some thoughts about where CARL should best invest our energies. So they really liked the idea of having a national library advocate for OER, that we could hone a message, perhaps put up a statement on OER or on open education, and use our voice for good. That we could help carve out and strengthen the role of librarians in OER, that we could help build a national, or at least support a national community of practice of librarians working in OER, that we could help develop leadership in this area. Sorry, just moving ahead here. Too many notes. But we did hear from them, and so I've got some notes here that Anne Ledbrook at Ryerson had put together about the different ways that librarians are typically involved in OER. And so certainly some institutions have created a position specifically for OER librarians, but many have not. Either way, those librarians are often assisting faculty with OER discovery. They might be working with the teaching and learning centers on campus. They might be working with student groups on advocacy. And often, many of these institutions, there would be a campus-wide OER committee, and that it's really essential. They all agreed that the library be at the table on that kind of a committee. That it's a great way to get buy-in at the campus level. It's a great place to have all the stakeholders at the table. Yeah. So I'm just going to move forward here. I guess we've already talked about this one. And also about this, what they were hoping to see from CARL activities. And then, so when we talked about creating some activities from CARL, we took tons of notes, we brainstormed a lot, and some of the things that came out from that, I had some notes on this somewhere. One thing that we thought was very interesting that everybody agreed on was they wanted whatever CARL did, that it should be available to everybody, that they really wanted to see every post-secondary librarian in Canada have access to CARL's planned activities. So that's what we did. And so we tried to build some programs that would establish leaders. We would try to support or get better education and understanding of OER within academic library community. So not just those librarians already involved in open education or knowing about it, but really for everybody. That we would put some support towards getting library directors up to speed, and that we would help develop communications efforts to improve relationship with other stakeholders and decision makers. So these are the things that we came up with. We created a one-year visiting program officer position for OER, and to go with that, an OER working group. So both are now in place. Well, we've just selected our visiting program officer, and we're very, very thankful and lucky that that's going to be Erin Fields from UBC. So she's had a lot of involvement in that BC OEL group and is very well placed within that community of practice in BC. And she's going to help us try to build a national community of practice. And we've just finalized our OER working group, and we had a terrific amount of interest from across the country. And we do have one person representing the Atlantic provinces. So Anne Smith is going to join our working group from Acadia. We're developing an OER mini forum for CARL directors. So that's probably the only thing at this point that we're considering that would be specific to CARL directors. But again, these are all the proposed things that our working group is going to look over and probably finesse to some degree. We're talking about an intensive OER workshop, and we had called it a boot camp, but we did hear some feedback that that was not the best term to use. So we're going to revise that name. And then, inspired by the ACRL's Scholarly Communication Roadshow, we are planning something similar, where there would be regional events, somewhat like this, to be honest, where you could introduce a large group of librarians. Potentially, in some areas, it'll be more than librarians, to OER. And then a communication strategy, which can involve, I know we had a lot of fantastic ideas. There was a lot of support for CARL creating a statement, having a bold statement on OER that could be used by other institutions to show the level of support for OER. And but then also speaking points, for example, because it might not be the same arguments or the same stories that are compelling with students than with faculty, than with administration. So that was something else we were asked to work on, speaking points when discussing open education and open educational resources with different community groups or stakeholders. So just, I'm going to wrap up, I think, here. I did put these 5 things together just quickly. There is that Canada OER list maintained by BC Campus. That's the email address I found on their website. I do recommend joining, so it's not just librarians. It's really anybody involved in OER across the country. And I do often see people posting messages like, do you know of any good textbook about this, open textbook? And it's a really great community to get feedback from. There's the BC OEL, as I mentioned, the Open Education Librarian Group in BC. They have their own website that includes resources that obviously can be reused and repurposed. So there is a Slack group for scholarly communication folks in Canada that was started by 2 practitioners, and we did create an OER channel within that group. So if you're interested in joining it, please email me and I'll put you in touch with the folks, the 2 librarians who started that group. There is some discussion happening there. It's a little bit infrequent. And then I'll mention Spark, which is North American. They have a LibOER list, which is a listserv specific to librarians involved in OER, which I highly recommend. It's a very active list, and there's a lot of people on it, but it can be very useful. There's also OpenCon, have a librarian community group that has, I believe it's monthly phone calls, and you can Google that and find it, or I'll link it. There is a page on the web for this. I'll link it before I send it to Cynthia. And then with any luck, we will have some sort of web presence and a way to join this community of practice and the Canadian community of librarians working in OER once our working group and VPO get cracking. So I'll keep you posted on that. And that is it from me.
Thank you, Lise. So we have time for a couple questions. Yes, Andrea.
Can you hear me, Lise?
Yeah.
I just have a question in terms of those workshops or the boot camps that aren't to be called boot camps. Are those going to be offered to non-CARL institutions?
Yes. So the plan for that intensive workshop is, and I guess I didn't get into the detail of it, so the plan is that it would be a 2 or 3 day event. At this point, we're just looking at doing it once, and we were hoping to do it in this coming fall. So again, we'll see once we have the working group in place what is realistic, but it would be absolutely open to anybody who's involved in OER in Canada and wants a deep dive.
Any other questions in the room or online? You're all muted by default, so if you want to ask a question verbally, just unmute yourself, or you can put something in the chat. And I didn't see any in the chat log, so.
I'll just say that somebody mentioned that Manisha Ketarpal at Meskwakis College is amazing, which is great to hear because she's going to be joining our working group. So we're very, very happy to have her perspective and her experience reflected in our working group. And I also hear that Connect OER is open to all institutions, not just Spark members. So that is great. Thank you for that update. Kim? And I know that one of the things that was suggested to us as a potential project for CARL would be to do an analysis of the Canadian data in Connect OER. So once you've all put your data in there, we might do that.